Good evening, everyone. I'm Taylor Lauren, and welcome back to another episode of Our Strange Reality. Tonight, I will be telling you the story about the Greenbrier Ghost, and this story revolves around a young woman whose tragic life became an unbelievable afterlife. Alvazona Heister was born in 1876 in Greenbrier, West Virginia. She seemed to have a typical 1800s upbringing. She was raised on a farm with her two parents and four older brothers. And really not much else is known about her short life in this holler in Appalachia. Now the second key figure in the story is Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe. And people think we have funny names these days. So Erasmus was born in Augusta County, Virginia, near Staunton, or Stanton, however you want to pronounce it. He was born around the year 1861, and after the Civil War, his family moved to West Virginia. Erasmus was described as a very strong man who could build anything with his hands. He was also considered very handsome for that time period, charismatic, and had a way with women. But Erasmus also had a reputation for being a jerk. In the early 1880s, he fathered an illegitimate child with a young lady. And when Erasmus refused to marry this poor woman, her brother and some family friends went to Erasmus's cabin in the middle of a cold winter's night. They dragged him outside and then to a close-by pond, where they shoved him into the ice and into the freezing water. But I guess it's what he deserved. Erasmus did end up marrying another young woman, and her name was Esty Cutlet. And this union was strange from the start. Reverend R.R. Little was asked to come to the Shoe family home in November of 1885. He was then asked to marry Erasmus to Esty, but Reverend Little felt uneasy about the whole situation. The vibes were a little off, so to speak. Reverend Little noticed that Esty looked terrified anytime that Erasmus got near her, and none of her family or friends was around for the supposed wedding ceremony for her, which was also very weird. So Reverend Little decided to not marry these two based on a paperwork technicality, because they were in Pocahontas County, but the marriage license was issued for Greenbrier County. And Erasmus suggested that they could just walk over to Greenbrier County. It was only a few miles away, even though it was freezing cold outside and well past midnight by this point. And somehow Erasmus did convince all of them to walk over to the next county. And when they finally made it over to Greenbrier County, Reverend Little again flat out refused to marry them. He said that there was no way he was going to marry these two on a backcountry road in the middle of the night. So Erasmus did end up finding a minister who did marry the two the next day. So this was obviously not a happy marriage. Gossip went around that Erasmus had a horrible temper, and he took his anger out on his young wife, frequently beating her to the point of near death. Rumors flew around town that he'd been threatening to kill her, and at one point he was even caught digging a grave, which they all assumed was for his poor young wife. But luckily for Esty, in 1888 Erasmus was caught stealing a horse and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The next year, Esty filed for divorce, claiming that he had abandoned her. Good for her. In June of 1894, Erasmus married again, to Lucy A. Tritt. And only a few months into this marriage, Lucy died under mysterious circumstances. And obviously, because of Erasmus's history, rumors flew that he'd murdered his wife. There were so many stories that went around town about how Lucy had met her untimely death. And go figure, all include Erasmus being her killer. They claimed everything from poisoning her to dropping a brick on her head and all sorts of other crazy rumors. But his family claimed that she simply fell on some ice on the way out to the outhouse and then died of her injuries. And her death is still a mystery. But considering his past and then the rest of the story, it's hard to not think that he was not somehow involved in her death. So with all these horrible rumors flying around about Erasmus from the town he was from, he decided to mosey on over to Greenbrier County and try to have a fresh start, where he started working as a blacksmith. And being new to such a small town, Erasmus drew a lot of attention from a lot of the eligible young ladies in town, especially from Miss Alvazona Heister. The two quickly started courting each other, and Zona was absolutely head over heels with this man. However, Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heister, could not stand the man. She had a bad feeling about Erasmus right from the beginning, and she didn't trust him one bit, especially not around her daughter. And eventually, over time, a lot of people in town started to feel that way about him. They all thought something was very off with this man, even though they had no idea about his past history. I guess if you're just a horrible person, that's the aura that you present to people and carry around with you. And eventually people are going to pick up on that. Mary Jane tried her best to get Zona to see what her and everyone else was saying about Erasmus, but Zona was too far gone into Erasmus's charm to care about what her mother had to say. And in October of 1896, Erasmus and Zona got married, and the two moved into a nice home near the blacksmith shop. And surprise, it did not take long for rumors to start flying around town that Erasmus was mistreating Zona. Are we starting to see the pattern here? In January of 1897, Erasmus was on his way to the blacksmith shop when he ran into a young local boy named Andy Jones. And Andy Jones would, from time to time, do small chores for them around their tiny little farmhouse. So on this day, Erasmus asked Andy to go to the house and collect eggs from the hen house, and then bring those eggs to Zona, who would be home at the time. So Andy, being the helpful little person that he was, went to the shoe home and went and collected the eggs. He then went inside the shoe home with his haul of eggs, and that's when poor little Andy found Zona dead on the dining room floor. So Zona was found lying on her back face up. She was completely stretched out, and her legs were placed perfectly together. One hand was on the ground beside her, and the other hand was draped over her stomach. So after discovering Zona's body, Andy first ran home to his mother, obviously. So then Andy and his mother both go to the blacksmith shop and then inform Erasmus that Zona had been found dead. And Erasmus rushed home and super dramatically cradled his dead wife's body in his arms and began to uncontrollably cry and sob and scream. Now, back in those days, it was customary for the women of the town to come and clean and dress the deceased body. But Erasmus, within minutes of having just grieved his dead wife, took her body upstairs and then performed this ritual by himself with no one else around. An hour later, the town doctor, Dr. Knapp, arrived at the shoe home. But by then, Zona's body had already been moved from the crime scene, her body cleaned and changed out of the clothes that she had died in. So there went any investigation procedures that they would have minimally even had at that time. So Dr. Knapp tried to perform an examination of the body as best as he could at this point. But Erasmus stayed next to Zona's body for this whole examination and continued to grieve uncontrollably, which people think made Dr. Knapp rush through this examination. It also didn't help that Erasmus had dressed Zona's body in a stiff collared neck dress, with a scarf wrapped around her neck as well. So Dr. Knapp just chalked up Zona's death to what he called an everlasting faint, because women were just such fragile creatures that a simple fainting spell could just put a woman in her grave. Now, when Mary Jane was told about her daughter's death, she didn't believe any of the silliness about a fainting spell. In fact, she declared that the devil killed her daughter, the devil being Erasmus. But of course, nothing could be done at this point, as the whole crime scene and Zona's body had been tampered with before a real investigation could happen. So the day after Zona's death, her body was taken to her parents' home. And when her coffin was placed into the home, Erasmus took it upon himself to stand watch over the head of this open coffin, never letting Zona's body out of his sight, and would start acting agitated and annoyed if anyone got too close to his wife's dead body. So of course, this being an open coffin viewing for all of Zona's loved ones to look upon her one last time, Erasmus did some strange things with the body. Like, instead of placing a pillow beneath his wife's head, he placed it to the side of her head and then wrapped up a sheet and then placed it on the other side as if trying to keep her head in place. Now, during the funeral service, Erasmus again still would not let anybody get near Zona's body, even going so far as to nail the coffin shut himself. Erasmus then gave Zona's mother, Mary Jane, the cloth that was on the one side of her head. And according to local lore, when Mary Jane washed this wrapped up cloth, it came out blood red. And many people think that this was the first sign of the spirit of Zona trying to reach out to her mother, because the next 4 nights in a row, Zona did show herself to her mother. The first night, Mary Jane was laying in bed, and she heard a sigh come from the darkness of the room, but she couldn't see anything there. Then she heard the sighing again. That's when she saw a form move out of the dark and slowly approach her. And when this form got closer to Mary Jane, it morphed itself into the apparition of Zona. And this caused Mary Jane to sit bolt upright in bed, and she reached out to her daughter, as any mother would. And she said that all she could feel was ice cold. Zona didn't say anything this first night, but she turned around and slowly started to move away from her mother. But as she was moving away, her head slowly fell and then turned 180 degrees exorcist style and looked at her mother. And then she vanished into the dark. And her terrified mother spent the rest of the night hiding underneath her covers, waiting for the sun to come out. Understandable. During the preceding 3 nights, Zona would continue to show herself to her mother. But during these 3 times, Zona would actually speak to her and would tell her about all the horrible things that Erasmus had done to her in life. Zona told her that on the night of her murder, that Erasmus had come home in a horrible temper, and upon finding out that Zona had not cooked meat for dinner, he turned his wrath onto her. He grabbed Zona by the throat, and using all his strength, he crushed her windpipe and snapped her neck. So after these 4 nights of visitations and heavy revelations, Mary Jane went to go see the county's prosecuting attorney, John Alfred Preston. Mary Jane spent hours recounting all the mysterious circumstances that led her to be standing in Mr. Preston's office, telling him an outlandish ghost story. But her retelling of events about Erasmus's strange behavior since the discovery of her daughter's body was compelling enough for Mr. Preston to feel that there was something deeply suspicious about Zona's death. Now, Mr. Preston, since he lived in this town, had already heard all the gossip about Erasmus's strange behavior. And the gossip at this point was that Erasmus was just a straight son of a bitch. So John Preston took the case. And he was obviously concerned about Mary Jane's testimony being from the ghost of her dead daughter. But she had good standing with the community. And Mr. Preston just said, fuck it, let's do it. So John Preston, along with Dr. Knapp, who did want a better opportunity to examine the body and set things straight, they had her body exhumed to perform a proper autopsy without Erasmus around. This examination took place in February, just a month after she had passed, and they found her body to still be in good condition, most likely because of the frigid winter temperature. Well, guess what Preston and Knapp discovered while doing the autopsy? They found that Zona's neck was broken, and her windpipe had been crushed, and her throat had distinct fingerprint markings, indicating that she had been strangled to death, with her neck dislocated at the first and second vertebrae. Erasmus was immediately arrested and thrown in jail, where he vehemently proclaimed his innocence, and how no one could prove it was him that did his wife in. And so, of course, Erasmus pleaded not guilty. The murder trial began in June of 1897. And obviously, this trial drew a lot of attention because of all the strange circumstances surrounding it. And it was during this time that Erasmus's past really came back to bite him in the ass, because now people found out that he was previously imprisoned for horse thievery and that he'd already been previously married and that wife died under mysterious circumstances. And obviously this swayed the jury into not liking this man. But obviously the highlight of this trial was Mary Jane Heaster's testimony about her ghost daughter. Now obviously her attorney Preston tried to leave that whole supernatural aspect out of her testimony, but the lawyer representing Erasmus definitely wanted to talk about the supernatural aspect of Mary Jane's testimony because he thought that that would make her look crazy. But this backfired on Erasmus's lawyer because Mary Jane was so steadfast in her convictions about what her daughter had told her, about how the spirit had presented herself to Mary Jane and told her everything that happened, and how all those things that the spirit of Zona had said about the circumstances of her death is what was found in the autopsy. And you have to remember that people were very superstitious back in those days. So while maybe they didn't all believe in ghosts or supernatural entities, it's kind of hard to dismiss the fact that what she was told is what was found. And on July 1st, 1897, the jury found Erasmus guilty of murder in the first degree. So with all this evidence, it was concluded that Erasmus intentionally broke his wife's neck. And Erasmus was given a life sentence in prison. And not everybody in the community was happy with that. There were a lot of people who thought that he deserved hanging. Again, because this is the 1800s, he was an outsider who had killed a local girl that everyone had known since she was born. So yeah, there were a lot of people who thought that he deserved death. And again, because it's the 1800s and because they were living in a holler in Appalachia, the townspeople decided to get together and create a lynching party. They decided they were gonna break into the jail and hang Erasmus themselves. But the local sheriff found out about the plot and hid Erasmus in the woods overnight until the lynching party disbanded. And Erasmus spent the rest of his days in the West Virginia State Penitentiary, where he died in March of 1900. And his unclaimed body was buried in the prison cemetery. I would assume that he didn't have any loved ones by that point. Mary Jane Heaster died in September of 1916, and throughout the rest of her life, she never recanted her story, and every time she told the story, it was the exact same. No details were ever left out or changed. So to this day, there's still a lot of controversy on whether Mary Jane had actually seen Zona, or whether it was just a distraught mother who, having so much suspicion and having seen all the circumstantial evidence, just hallucinated this whole story. Maybe she did, but in the end, she was right. Mother's intuition. So whether you believe the story about the Greenbrier Ghost and the circumstances that led to a man getting life in prison for murder, what we can take away from this is that Zona's spirit represents that badass fighter in all of us, who seeks justice against those who thought that they could commit harm without consequences. Zona, even after her physical death, found a way to send her abuser to prison, and hopefully she finally found that peace that she was not allowed to have in life. So you can go visit Elva Zona's grave. When I was driving through West Virginia on the 64, Greenbrier is right off the highway. It took me about 15 minutes of driving some sketchy one-lane dirt roads to get to this tiny little cemetery that her grave is in. And you can tell that she still has a lot of visitors to this day because they all left little gifts for her on her gravesite, which is sweet, especially for such tragic figures with such short lives. It's nice to be honored and remembered like that. So if you want to go introduce yourself to Zona, I highly recommend it if you're in the area. Alright, thank you for joining me in another journey into our strange reality. Have a wonderful evening. Try not to become a ghost.